Okay. So the theme of this, our first session, our first network stimulus is practicality. So perhaps to remind you, if, I don't know if all of you were present or have watched the talk I gave at the beginning of the festival, the introductory talk. But there I talked about 4 criteria for the middle way, really. So 4 things that might help you know it if you saw it. So yeah, I'm going to share actually a PowerPoint which has those on. Yeah, so yeah, those 4 characteristics, I called them, of the middle way. That is practical and universal, and judgment focused, and error focused. So those 4 things, it's just a handy list. I found people find lists handy just to help get a handle on things. Obviously, it's just an analysis. You could conceivably cut it up in different ways. But the idea of the middle way being practical, well, you can tell whether something is the middle way according to whether it's practical. But the question of what we mean by practical is a pretty important one to start off with. So first thing to say is that practicality, the most simple way of thinking about middle way practicality is that it includes both where we are now and where we want to get to. So includes both realism and idealism, you could say, in the common sense of those terms. So if you're very focused on ethics and spirituality or something like that, then you might get a bit idealistic, focusing too much on how things ought to be. Actually, the same can be true of political ideology. Or if you're very scientifically minded, you might be focusing very much on where you are now. Or maybe if you're very commonsensical as well, that's another alternative. But the middle way involves keeping them both in focus at the same time and trying to maintain the tension between them. So trying to focus on the whole process. So that's one obvious way in which the middle way is practical, holding both those things in mind. Now, but probably this kind of bigger issue to do with this is the idea that in some ways theory can be practical, and that can be quite a difficult thing sometimes for people to get their heads around. So that doesn't mean, of course, that all theory is practical necessarily, but some theory is practical. So I'm going to start with an example here, or discuss an example, which I thought I'd use a very obviously practical example. So supposing you are assembling flat pack furniture. Yeah, that's a kind of stereotypical practical task, isn't it? That some of us may have struggled with at various times. So you've got a set of instructions for, let's call it item XYZ. So that seems obviously practical, isn't it? It's a particular goal you've got. You want to assemble this furniture, and this tells you how to do it. So I assume everyone would agree that that's practical. But then let's think about the slightly bigger picture regarding assembling flat pack furniture. So those of you, including me sometimes, who've struggled with assembling flat pack furniture might be concerned about the instructions or ability to follow or interpret them. So supposing we had a book called How to Interpret Flat Pack Furniture Instructions. So that would give us a slightly bigger context. It might give us tips like, for example, how to think of diagrams in 3D, or how to focus on the details in the diagrams that might be most useful. How to deal with kind of ambiguities perhaps you get in these instructions, and how to use your anticipation to interpret them. That would still be quite specific though, wouldn't it? But then, if you agree that that's practical too, maybe we could go to a further level of generalization. So to interpret flat pack furniture instructions, you need the skill of interpretation. So you could have a book about that, and that will be an area of critical thinking. So that would go through the kinds of skills involved in recognizing ambiguity, for example, and dealing with it, and all the ways in which your expectations interfere with what you see or hear or observe. You could go still more general than that. So you could have a book about why interpretation skills are important for addressing conditions. So why we need interpretation skills. So what sort of overall view of how we ought to live our lives would include it being important to have interpretation skills, which we could then apply to lots of different examples. So as far as I can see, all the way up that sort of ascent, if you like, we're getting to high levels of generalization, but it's still practical all the way up. It's just that the further up we go, the more things we're thinking about practically, potentially. And perhaps we're preparing ourselves for new events, maybe unexpected events, where we have to respond in practical ways. So that's what I refer to as adequacy, as trying to prepare ourselves for a wider range of conditions than the ones we currently have to deal with, perhaps. So just to perhaps label those levels, so the specific practicality, topic level practicality, what I call deep generic skills. So they're skills, but they're quite, they're broad skills of a kind that are very flexible, and you have to change the way you operate in quite a deep way to develop them. And then finally, practical philosophy. So middle way philosophy is practical philosophy. It's kind of at the top of that tree usually, although it might be applied, of course. Okay, so I want to argue all of those things are practical, but there are, of course, kinds of theory that are not practical. So the progress there might go the other way. So it will be top down rather than bottom up. So we might start, for example, with some kind of dogmatic philosophy telling us ultimate truths about the universe. And from that, we will deduce, we will work out, we will apply those supposed ultimate truths to learn how to read divine truths in the universe, find the revelations. And that might lead us to a more sort of topic level skill. So how to read the secret codes from the Illuminati in flat pack furniture instructions. So you could argue that's a practical, topic level practical skill, isn't it? But it's based on a very narrow understanding of what you're doing and what the purpose of it is. So that will take you back to the instructions we started with, but you will be dealing with them in a rather impractical way, because there'll be lots you won't take into account, like the point of the instructions, really. So that's just maybe an example of practicality and impracticality. It's not just about how generally or specifically we're talking. It's about primarily whether we're working in a top-down or bottom-up way. Are we thinking about things in a way that just extends to more examples, or are we starting off with some sort of absolute belief and then perhaps unknowingly applying that in specific ways, which are then less practically helpful, but maybe not helpful at all, maybe just a big distraction. Okay, and then one other respect in which the middle way is practical. So I'm going to suggest that the middle way also needs to be practical by focusing on intermediate goals. So this diagram tries to show roughly how that works. So if you think about short-term goals to start with a short-term goal, you're only focused on something very immediate that takes up, well, it kind of fills your view. Yeah. So with a short-term goal, you're not very likely to be looking at very much beyond that short-term goal. You won't be taking much about the context into account. You won't be thinking about some other time when things might be different, when you might have different assumptions. And then in contrast, the final goal, well, if you have a final goal, like, for example, the idea of enlightenment in Buddhism, then you might think, well, that's a very big picture thing. But the trouble is that it's so non-specific that you may just be dealing with an absolute idea that has no relationship, particularly to your experience, apart from this concept that you have, which stands for your goal. So the chances are, if you're fixed on final goals, that actually you're working towards shorter term ones, and you're just using that final goal as a kind of substitute. So you're substituting the short-term goal for the final one. So the trouble with final goals is they tend to be absolute in that sense, or our beliefs about them tend to be absolute, unless you're using them in a kind of archetypal way as a form of inspiration. And I think enlightenment in Buddhism can be used in that way. It can be practically helpful in that way. Not because you're sort of making deductions from it about how you ought to act directly, but because it's reminding you of ways that you can be inspired and motivated. So in between those two extremes, the short, only focusing on short-term goals and fixating on final goals that are just abstractions, we have intermediate goals. So in an intermediate goal, you've got something that's realistic, that you can have a clear idea of, but it's within your experience. So my suggestion is that the middle way also requires us to try and navigate between those extremes as well. Okay, so just to summarize then, before I go on too long, my ideas about what practicality means here. So practicality means focusing on clear goals that address conditions over time. So we're not just focusing on what we do this week or even this year, but perhaps changing ourselves over a period of time, maybe changing society. Those could be relatively clear goals within our experience. But we also have to reach them from where we are now. So there's this tension between our goals and the realistic view of the situation. But in practical beliefs, lose that link with experience. So they tend to be idealized, and they're deduced in a top-down way from absolute assumptions. Whether it's in something about God's will or conspiracy theory or enlightenment or whatever it is. So I suggest that goals need to be intermediate for a sufficient perspective. So to be practical, obviously, is to work towards goals that are not just kind of short-term ideas about what you want right now, but longer-term goals about which involve integrating who you are now with who you might be in the future, for example, with taking into account those more neglected aspects of our experience. So intermediate goals can do that, but maybe final goals don't. So ideas about final goals are likely to be impractical unless their function is that of inspirational association. In other words, as I use the term, if they're archetypal. Okay, so that's it, and I think I've kept it down to 15 minutes as I intended. So it may be too compressed, but my idea is I hope that anything that's not clear there, you can now ask questions and unpick, or do feel free to ask any critical questions as well that you want to ask about what I've said. So we'll do that just for 15 minutes, and then you can break up into your groups and explore it in a much more personal way. Okay, so yeah, probably easiest thing is if you could, if you look on the participants list, if you could do the virtual hand raising if you want to say anything. So Lenny, got there first.
Hi, I have a question about, an example of sort of how to start working with this sort of practical use of the middle way. In terms of, the example is dealing with something like groupthink, where you've got a group of people who've all got very stuck in a particular viewpoint and are all reinforcing it for each other. How would you suggest you could start, incrementally trying to sort of, worm your way into that, to sort of perhaps try and, put a bit more space around whatever it is they're stuck on, to try and start shifting things?
To try and shift groupthink. I mean, in some ways you may not be able to, because it's also a matter for them as individuals. But maybe one approach would be to discuss it with them as individuals. That's just a suggestion to trigger a more individual response. But would anyone else like to make any suggestions? Okay. Lucy?
Yeah, I just wonder if there's something about, since you were just talking about goals, I was wondering if there was something around refreshing a sense of purpose in the group, like just revisiting what the goal is, to try to get people kind of back focused on that, because often groupthink is a kind of myopia that sets in and people kind of forget the bigger picture. So that can be one way.
Yep. Good suggestion. Yeah.
That's very helpful, actually. Yeah, and certainly I can see a place for that in the situation I'm thinking of, that sort of, to sort of try to reorient them to the sort of bigger picture of why the group was set up in the first place, and how this sort of little rabbit hole that some of them have gone down, is not really fulfilling that purpose. So thank you, and thanks, Robert, too.
Yeah, so if you get a group to discuss its goals in terms that link sufficiently to experience, I would have thought that helps a lot. So it's easy for a group to take shortcuts through groupthink if it's got absolute beliefs that take the place of having to discuss what their experience is and how what difficulties they might be having relating to each other. Okay, any other thoughts or questions? Peter?
Where does this lie in relation to that much loved language of curriculum planning, aims and objectives? Because clearly within the phrases aims and objectives, that there is a type of discrimination of what you're doing, one which I have to say I never quite fully understood when I was writing my documents for the inspectors. But can we discriminate a little more in what we are trying to achieve by sort of refining out of what we're doing?
Sure, I would have thought so. I mean, that's where you get into the language of chunking, isn't it? And so it's if you've got what I call an intermediate objective, which may be quite relatively long term. So if you were teaching a class and you wanted to get them to a certain point in understanding something, then you break down how you get there. That's sort of standard educational way of working, isn't it? But I guess the issue is sometimes that maybe not so much the teachers these days as maybe the students themselves or some other people may start with an absolutized final goal. You ought to be like this when you're not. It's a goal which is too abstract, which is too removed from the student's experience, and therefore impossible to really apply. Okay, any other comments, questions? Lucy?
Do you mind a question that's wider than the practicality?
That's fine, yeah.
So forgive me, because I realize you've written a lot of books on the subject and I haven't read any of them yet. But I was curious if you could answer for me how because you've come up with this theory, as I understand it, and therefore you've chosen the 4 elements that you just refreshed our memories on the beginning. And whether you want to just answer it for practicality or whether you want to answer it for all 4, I'd just love to sort of ground my understanding of your theory in what made you choose those 4. I know this is a big question, so I don't expect an expansive answer, but just to give me a flavor, coming to it completely new now, of why those 4, and if you don't mind being relatively personal and practical in that sense, how you've applied it to your life or the significance that it's had for you, because it's obviously had an enormous intellectual significance, I'm guessing, because there's such a body of work around it. But it would just bring it to life for me a bit more if I understood where you've come from it more personally.
Sure.
Big question, sorry.
Yeah. Well, let me just sort of pick something out of that. So in terms of practicality, what does practicality mean to me personally? I mean, it's come out of, I suppose, a life history where I practiced meditation. I was in a Buddhist context for quite a few years, and also an experience of living in a Buddhist community, and I learned a lot from the sort of interactions that happened there, the way they ran things, which involved that quite often a kind of balance which had been reached through a practical process. So I guess I have a lot of my more sort of visceral sense of what practicality or effective practicality means from those kinds of experiences. And then I've kind of explored, obviously, more intellectually what that implies. So yeah, I mean, there are sort of similar answers I could make for the other 4 criteria, but obviously they've all emerged from a process which began with practice, but then obviously became one of philosophy. And we'll be talking about those more in the ensuing sessions. Okay. Barry, you're muted.
I'm just reflecting there on what Lucy said and just thinking what practicality means for me. And when you said that it was related to meditate, that wasn't meditation and your experience in a community. That wasn't something that would spring to mind to me. It's more for me. Practicality means what works in a sense, and I suppose that's quite a wide term. So maybe what addresses conditions most adequately, and I think it's perhaps the main reason I'm drawn to this, the middle way. In many ways, it's the fact that it's not just some dry intellectual juggling. It's actually something that I feel I can and have applied to my life and to the wider world that's I think's had that's had a positive effect, has an effect that's addressed things more adequately. So that's what it means to me. I was just wondering if other people have any reflections on what practicality means to them, because it might be actually, and obviously in a wider sense, it was we were talking about the same thing, but that's how I'm drawn to the term.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, it does also mean practicality in all sorts of other senses. Obviously, I was just trying to say something about where the deepest roots of it are for me. But yeah, obviously, politics, for example.
Yeah.
Politics seems to me to be the art of what works. So applying it in anything other than a practical way, can be disastrous. But that's another discussion. Hey, any other thoughts, Howard? You're muted.
I was going to ask something about just the process and about the timescales. The reason I ask is because earlier today I was watching, it was a debate that was on TV, and it was to do with, it was a debate on TV between Piers Morgan and somebody, and it was about a gender situation thing, and it was about somebody saying there are 100 genders, and Piers Morgan was accused of trivialising the thing by referring to himself as a penguin or something, saying he can identify as a penguin or something like this, you see. And there was this furious debate going on, and it led to discussions as well about, and I think he was talking about a school in Brighton where there's 75 children in a school are identified as non-gender specific and things like this. And the reason my question is, well, at some point, people can talk about these things and people can have healthy and hopefully good-natured debates about the whole thing with, you know, gender. But at some point, decisions have to be made about policy and about what does happen if you put your child into a school. Then will somebody be saying to your child is not going to be classed as a male or a female, this is our policy? Or and there was another one in one of the universities in London where they were refusing to use the word woman. And then they were in between, in the word woman or women, and in between the M and the N, they were putting like an asterisk or something, so as not to cause offence to transgender people and things like this. Well, at some point then, people can debate this. And the other question was about timescales, about using kind of middle way ideas. Somebody's in a policy making situation in government, how long have they got to make these decisions, and about how the middle way process will, because I think you're very clear, Robert, the middle way thing is not just about endless debating things and being indecisive, it's about actually making decisions and doing practical things. So how would this work in a situation like the ones I've outlined?
Well, you have to, obviously, in any situation, you've got to make an assessment of the time scale you've got, haven't you? So for example, decisions about COVID-19 or whatever are time-framed in the sense that the government had to act quite quickly in order to respond to the situation. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons I suggest that we've got to try and take into account, you know, that any decisions that were made in relation to it had to face a very complex set of conditions and had to be made on the basis of limited information relatively quickly. And that makes a difference to the issues. So, and obviously the same applies to us. So there's no, as individuals, there's no point being especially hard on ourselves for decisions that we made in a particular situation where we had to act quickly. Is that answering your question, Howard? I'm not sure.
Yeah, because I say like the COVID-19 thing is a case in point, isn't it? As you say, because when there's something which is urgent, you know, decisions have to be made about what is done, and people can't just say, well, we've got 2 years to look at this. Something has to be done, doesn't it? And so that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
But that's, I mean, I think that is another aspect of practicality, which maybe I could have mentioned, is that taking the right amount of time. So that when we've got the opportunity to think more, then doing so, rather than using shortcuts, which are what absolutizations are. But when we haven't got time, then obviously we have to act quickly. So that's it.
But there's also sometimes we don't have the option to reflect much. You know, you might be middle of winter and there's a child drowning in a pool in the park. You haven't got much time to think, whether should I get a boat or what. You've just got to make that decision. But then you do later still have the opportunity to reflect on whether that was a good decision or not. So it's not like you still can't bring that practicality to it, to the process.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, I'll stop recording there. So.